Greetings, Grimdark enjoyers. Today I want to talk about indirect weapons. There's probably a joke to be made there, but nothing is jiving with me at the moment. So consider this the first call to comment. Share your zingers. As for where to begin, indirect fire has been an issue for Games Workshop for the last few editions. And when you take a look at the paradigm of the tabletop, it's not without reason. You see, because of the alternating turns, which involve all of one player's units activating before the other player gets a chance to, the ability to evenly trade is on a spectrum. Though, this is also in part because there is no initiative stat which would refine fight order, but regardless, it still falls on a spectrum. At the far end, you would have fight phase interactions. Perhaps the enemy you've charged into has fights first, and will attack you before you attack them despite having charged. Or perhaps they have a fight on death ability, giving enemy models you manage to destroy a chance to go down swinging. Or maybe you just roll a little cold and the enemy unit gets a heftier swing back than you expected. Towards the middle, we have shooting interactions, which in most cases usually offers no immediate counterattack. There are a select few stratagems that offer a reactive return fire, but for the most part, units need to expose themselves to being shot back on the following enemy turn if they want to shoot at you, because line of sight is a thing. Further left of that, we would have abilities like Fire and Fade, which are rare and usually expensive, which allow units to shoot and shift away again behind line of sight blocking terrain. And then at the very far left, we would have indirect weapons, which do not require line of sight. And so, after laying all of that out, I think it paints a pretty clear picture. It's fair to say, if you can deal damage to your enemy without having to expose yourself in turn, it's going to yield a demonstrative advantage. This is the nature of indirect fire weapons. But because of this, it feels as though we're stuck in a hellish purgatory, an endless cycle of Games Workshop adding indirect fire to the game at the edition's start. And knowing it has a demonstrative advantage, as we've laid out, GW seeks to temper it, adding rules like indirect fire weapons only hit on 4s, and the target you're shooting at always gains the benefit of cover. And so you think, okay, so indirect weapons only hit half the time. They still have to wound, and their targets gain the benefits of cover. That isn't so bad. Only for GW to say, surprise, and then add indirect fire units to the game, and grant them abilities like ignores cover or heavy. And just like that, there goes half of those tempering mechanics which were supposed to keep indirect fire weapons in check. Let's hope Space Marines don't have easy access to rerolls, or easy methods to give units perks like sustained or lethal hits. That would be a problem. And you know what? For the sake of clarity, I'll specify. In the Space Marine Desolation Squad example, they certainly do. Attaching the ubiquitous Space Marine Lieutenant gives a unit lethal hits. And the ever-popular Gladius Strike Force gives easy access to sustained hits. And the Space Marines Army rule can give full rerolls to hit to the target of your choice. And now also adds +1 to your wound rolls if you're not a special snowflake chapter. And if you really want to be that guy, you could deploy your Desolation Squad on the upper floor of a terrain feature to gain extra AP from plunging fire. Which I'll happily point out doesn't make a lick of sense. It really takes the cake for narrative dissonance of game mechanics. I mean, if plunging fire is supposed to increase AP because attacks are being delivered vertically, from above, it stands to reason all indirect fire weapons would gain plunging fire at all times because all of their attacks are going up and over when fired indirectly. It's baffling. It's so mechanically dissonant. But that's rules as written for you. Well, poorly managed rules as written. But where does that leave us? Right. It leaves us in a place where, because Games Workshop has granted units with indirect fire rules to override the rules intended to rein in the potency of indirect fire, as well as being able to benefit from layers of buffs, those units get point taxed or mechanically neutered. A truly masterful display of rules upkeep and game mechanics here.
My goodness, what an idea. Why didn't I think of that?
Now, in my experience, I've found it's fairly common for competitive players who enjoy the balanced feel of the game to bemoan indirect weapons. If I were to paraphrase the position, it's something like, when indirect is good, the game is bad, because of the demonstrative advantage indirect fire possesses. However, on the flip side, Games Workshop keeps making models and units aiming to flex indirect weapons. And admittedly, those models are awesome, and the rules should aspire to not make them shit. I am sure more than a few Guard players are annoyed by how their indirect fire weapons and emplacements operate. And to those who are extra forgiving of GW, those who feel that Games Workshop is just the best. It is simply substandard to yield to a paradigm where units are so good they're considered broken, only to be made undesirable due to points hikes and erratas a few months later. It's not something that should be perceived as well-serving. It may be excellent for GW's ever-increasing profits to heavily incentivize new products, and only fix the issues after they have cleared their inventory. But it is a paradigm that actively punishes the hobby efforts of those who have invested, which is bad. And so, I'm vehemently against this idea that indirect should be bad. Why? Because the game, referring to the matched play battlefield of L-shaped ruins, works better when artillery is undesirable? That's a pitiful standard to hold, as it falls on the shoulders of the rules writers to make it work. Indirect weapons should fundamentally be good. They should be a valuable battlefield asset. But, as you guys know, I am a man of culture, and I believe we can have a paradigm which serves both. Where indirect is valuable, where artillery units feel good to put on the tabletop, and one where they don't feel like they trade unfairly. And you know me, I like to balance a bit of critique with a bit of good old rules theory. And, to find the solution to this problem, I think we can look no further than the humble Tyranid Biovore. Yes, the Biovore. Perhaps there are other units which could serve as a comparable example, but I'll talk about what I know. Biovores are the classic Tyranid indirect fire weapon beast. They are equipped with a spore mine launcher, a weapon which operates in line with similar indirect fire or artillery units. However, its ability allows it to spawn a unit of spore mines instead of shooting with its spore mine launcher. This results in the Biovore providing two mechanical utilities to represent its value as an indirect firing artillery piece. It can deal damage indirectly, or can spawn units to the battlefield, which provides board control utility and can deal cheeky mortal wounds if those spore mines are left alive. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. I believe the solution to indirect fire weapons lies in dividing units which wield indirect fire weapons into two types. We'll call one spawn utilities, and the other damage dealers. We'll start with spawn utilities first. Now, I'm not claiming all indirect units of this type should be spawning spore mines. Spawning living bombs is something which should be obviously quintessentially alien, and should be reserved as a unique flex for Tyranids. However, in a similar manner, why couldn't the tactical utility of artillery emplacements be represented by other spawnables? This does not mean it has to be a unit like with spore mines, but even something like markers become quite interesting. This actually refers to a mechanic I shared in my Fixing the Imperial Guard Siege Regiment video. Essentially, the way it would operate is, instead of setting up a spore mine within range of the Biovore, you would set up a marker in range of the artillery unit in question. A marker which would represent that unit's target area of bombardment. You could even make it a universal rule called bombardment. In your shooting phase, this unit can place a marker anywhere on the battlefield surface within X inches. Units that come within 3 inches of this bombardment marker are said to be in its bombardment zone. and this marker remains in place until your next shooting phase, or until this unit is destroyed. Then different units could trigger their intended effects based off of their placed bombardment markers. Things like, units which pass through this unit's bombardment marker reduce their move by 2 inches. Units which pass through this unit's bombardment marker suffer a -1 to hit until the end of their next shooting phase. Personally, I like more out-of-the-box utility, such as using these markers to deny enemy units from deep striking within that radius. Really, it feels like rich design space for making indirect weapons valuable, and it does so without trying to walk this tightrope of trying to make them hit just hard enough while fighting against other indirect weapon profiles that the unit in question may possess, all while trying to thread this needle of making it feel fair to deal damage indirectly. But I suppose that brings us to the other type of indirect weapons, the damage dealers. Now, while I like the spawn utility concept, there are certainly going to be cases where an indirect fire weapon dealing damage without line of sight is the best thematic choice. Now, as we've covered, these weapons have an inherent advantage being able to deal damage without exposing themselves. GW is right in that it needs to be tempered, but making that tempering mechanism a kind of permeable barrier is inadequate. The idea of forcing indirect fires to be a standard ballistic skill worse than the average faction's ballistic skill standard, and providing the benefits of cover to the target unit doesn't work. Not when you have the means to juice up those weapons with pluses to hit, crit hit benefits, rerolls, sustained hits, and other perks like ignoring cover. It's just a terrible, muddy solution. For one, it opens up the doors to rules lawyering as players try to decipher which sacred Jedi text supersedes all the others, and results in this ping-pongy scale of weapon potency, which honestly, I imagine makes it a nightmare to evaluate. And so, damage-dealing indirect weapons need a harder barrier to temper them, compared to GW's permeable one. I think it should be as follows. Indirect fire weapons of this damage-dealing type have their operational profile and abilities set for their designed lethality. So, let's not write in abilities and rules assuming it'll be capable of being made one worse or one better, affected by who knows what. As an example, we'll use the Guard's Field Ordnance Bombast Field Gun. If the Bombast Field Gun is supposed to be a blast weapon intended to indirectly threaten elite infantry, its profile would stay the same, but its ballistic skill would be brought in line with its faction standard, so 4+. And in this case, I'd probably get rid of heavy since we're baking in that accuracy bonus. Now, while this just seems categorically better, what tempers such weapons is this alternative version of the indirect fire ability. The first part is unchanged from what we know. Weapons with the indirect fire tag in their profile are known as indirect fire weapons, and attacks can be made with them even if the target is not visible to the attacking model. These attacks can destroy enemy models in a target unit even though none may have been visible to the attacking unit when you selected that target. However, instead of forcing a -1 to hit with stipulating hit rolls of 1 to 3 always fail and granting the target of the indirect weapons the benefits of cover, we replace all of that with, if no models in a target unit are visible to the attacking unit when you select that target, then each time a model in the attacking unit makes an attack against that target using an indirect fire weapon, a successful hit is only scored on a 6, regardless of any other rules that attack is benefiting from. In addition, in this circumstance, the plunging fire rule has no effect. That last part is just for my sanity. But now we effectively have a paradigm where the damage-dealing indirect fire weapons effectively operate with the same efficacy as firing Overwatch, making blind firing indirect weapons unreliable, and in turn far less OP. Which sure sounds undesirable. Why would you ever take it? But here's the kicker. That indirect fire rule goes on to stipulate, the only exception to this rule is if the target unit is within 24 inches of a friendly spotter unit in your army. In such cases, these weapons can score successful hits using their ballistic skill as normal. Now I'd say we're cooking, and refined the paradigm further, so that each faction's units or army rules can specify which units serve as their spotters. So for Space Marines, you'd have Scouts, Phobos units, and Land Speeders speaking to their old telemetry rules. Eldar could use Rangers and Shroud Runners, Orcs could use Commandos, the Guard could use Sentinels. Though going off the cuff like this, I can't recall all the units which would be suitable for each faction, but I'm sure the concept is clear enough. Tempering damage-dealing indirect fire weapons in this way opens up another layer for units in your army to cooperate in a more interesting manner. And I think the design space can open up further beyond just particular datasheets having the spotter keyword. It feels pretty tasteful for me for any Tyranid Synapse creature to be treated as a spotter unit, if the attacking unit, in this case Hiveguard, are also in Synapse range. Which feels much more evocative of what Synapse is, and how truly alien, how different it should feel. We could also consider the Tau Empire. If they had a less bland iteration of the Marker Light system, one of the Marker Light benefits could be that the target is now considered visible to a spotter, or even sub-factions like the Thousand Sons. It's pretty easy to imagine that they would be able to use their psychic rituals to be able to see through the veil, to be able to basically serve as a spotter through the use of their sorcery. Again, I think you get the idea. And I guess that brings this one to a close. Indirect weapons. I think we can all agree, as they are currently, they are divisive, don't really feel very satisfying or tasteful. Or maybe you completely disagree, and think they are perfect. In either case, let me know in the comments. I'd also be curious to hear feedback on my proposed solutions. That being indirect weapons being categorized into two different types. Units which can generate utility through spawned markers and models, versus blind firing indirect damage dealers, which are made accurate when used with spotters. Oh, and also, if you have any suggestions for particular unit types or weapon types which are worthy of a similar sort of dissection, leave those in the comments below. Well, that's a wrap on this one. If you enjoyed this video, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And special thanks to Julius Maximus, as well as my other generous patrons and channel members. Channel members and patrons get early access to regular channel videos, as well as free access to various STL doodads. Just a little something for those who help keep the dream alive.
Save the dream!
Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.